if they do a video of this talk, it's going to be kind of weird.
Oh. Okay, great. Thank you for coming tonight, and for you're welcome for the show. That was the entertainment portion, or the song and dance portion. Now Carole can give us the hard facts. So I want to thank Carole Simon Smolinski for coming all the way up the grade from Lewiston, and her husband Max. Thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. Carole is the first in our fall speaker series in advance of Waterways, arriving on December 9th. Waterways is a Smithsonian traveling exhibit. It's about the relationship between people and water. And we are getting people excited about the exhibit and informing them by having these speakers join us and talk about different topics. Carole is an author. She is based in Lewiston and went to the University of Idaho as well as Portland State University, but has grown up along the Snake and Clearwater rivers, and they really influence her writing and the subjects she writes about. Tonight she's going to talk to us about the first 8 decades of steamboat travel on the Columbia and Snake River. And I'm sure at the end Carole will be happy to take some questions from the audience. She, as she self-proclaimed steamboat lady now in the Quad City area, so ask her your toughest questions. And then also at the end, Carole does have a couple of her books for sale, and she has really generously offered to donate part of the proceeds back to the Latah County Historical Society. So if you are inspired to learn a little bit more, you can help out Carole, you can help out us, and you can help yourselves be more informed. So Carole, who is also a board member from the Nez Perce County Historical Society, please join us. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming, and I thank Dulcie for inviting me. This is kind of an exciting topic. We'll see how the pictures go. You're going to miss a lot of pictures, but at least you'll get the idea. But before I talk about this first picture, Dulcie asked me to mention what the rivers mean to me and how it's influenced my writing. And I hadn't really thought about that subject very much, so I really appreciate her having asked me that. And my first thought was, I absolutely love the river. I live in Lewiston. The Snake is my main river. I absolutely love the river. And nothing personal, but I can't imagine not living on a river. All of my life, except for my first 11 years and then a couple, little dabs of time in between, all of my life, I've either lived on the Columbia or the Snake River. It's become an important part of me. So it's such a subtle part you don't even think about it. But when I think of the river, as I drive by it or walk along it every single day, I look at the river and I see one thing that always impresses me is that it's always moving. It's always moving forward to a destination, constantly. You just know that what you're seeing here, you're not ever going to see again, and it's headed to an ultimate destination. It always changes. There's times when, in the early morning, midday, late afternoon, the river always has a different mood, a different appearance. Different seasons make it look different. Sometimes that Snake River is as blue as that bridge, and other times it's just as green and murky as maybe this carpet right here. It changes with the seasons. It changes with the weather. It's choppy. It's smooth. It's got interesting bird patterns. I mean, I just absolutely love that river. That's primarily the Snake, but I feel that way about the Clearwater too. And as I thought about it then, again, because I was asked to think about it, I see the river in many ways as a metaphor for history. And I've never made that connection before. But if you think about time is always moving forward, I believe, to a destination. I have no idea what the destination is, but it's constantly moving. It never stops. It never goes backwards. It's always in the move, just like the river. It's always changing. No matter how dim something and grim something might look today, it's going to be better tomorrow, or the reverse. There's always a change in it. And like the river, you're only seeing the surface. Even historians, we're just barely probing below the surface. We're never going to get to the depth of time. We're never going to see the whole picture. Just like with the river, you're never going to understand and see the whole waterway, the whole water. You know, there's undercurrents that are influencing its flow and its character, just like the undercurrents of time that are influencing the direction of time. So I thought, well, that's really interesting to make that connection. That, I guess, has been part of the way I've thought, but I just never put two and two together before. So thank you for the question. So as far as my personal life and how it's influenced my writing, like I said, I was 11 when we moved to Clarkston. My family moved to Clarkston from Cottonwood, and I grew up on itty-bitty Cottonwood Creek, and I played down there, too. I used to go down and build forts and stuff. That was my activity. But my mom and dad never knew what I was up to, but they didn't care. It was a little town. But anyway, when I moved to Clarkston, the river was the river then, and there was a beautiful Clarkston beach, and I would go to the beach to swim, and I even taught swimming lessons there for a while. I swam the river a few times. I learned to water ski on the river. In the wintertime, we'd go down to what we'd call Third Pond below Clarkston, and there were kind of sloughs that would freeze, and we'd go ice skating in the winter. During my sophomore year in high school, I'd go down and gather the bugs and the flowers for our biology class at the Third Pond. So the river access was here, the beach, here where the water skiing was, but not constant. You couldn't access the river everywhere. But it was still really a beautiful river with riffles and ins and outs and nice vegetation along the way. It was a really beautiful river. And then in 1970, and I married Max back there, who was also from Clarkston. And we left before we married, but we left, and in 1979 we moved back after quite an absence. And the river was not the same river by then. It was a totally different river. The last dam, Lower Granite, had been built in 75, so it was 4 years earlier. It was now slack water slowed down by the dam instead of the more free-flowing river that I knew and grew up with. It was different. It was 40 feet higher. That's pretty important. So the old places that I knew were gone. And the Clarkston Beach, we get a kick out of this all the time. The Corps of Engineers decided that they were going to make a brand new beach because they had ruined this totally beautiful Clarkston Beach. So upriver a ways, they made this beach. And you know what? Now Clarkston Beach is back, and the old Corps of Engineers beach is gone. Swimming holes been closed. I think the river did it again. You know, the Corps just didn't get it. But anyway, the river was different, but there was something about it I really liked, too, and that was because now there were dikes along the river, and one could walk way out North Lewiston all the way to Hell's Gate State Park, about 5 miles from the confluence on the Idaho side, or from the confluence of the Clearwater and Snake all the way to Asotin. And so every day I would either walk the dogs or walk myself, and I still do, to the river, along the river, down to the river. It's just become a total part of my daily life. And in the old days, you couldn't do that because you just couldn't get to the river that many places. And I remember my folks would say, don't go on Snake River Avenue because that's where the bums live. Well, the bums did live on Snake, you know, and so there were places we were just told not to go as kids. So it was a different river, and I'm not going to get into the debate, is it better or worse? It's different. And maybe I'm different. I think I am. I'm older. You know, doggone. So it's a river that suits me at this time in my life, and I love it. I just love it. I still find beauty in it like I used to. How did that influence my writing, though? And this is where I think the river is what got me into writing history. When we moved back, we saw tugs and barges. That's the first thing that influenced my brain. I thought, wow, these great big tugs and barges. I had lived in Cologne for a while on the Rhine, and I saw these big tugs and barges up and down the river in the middle of Germany, way inland. And I saw the same thing now in Lewiston. And I thought, wow, this is a corridor to Portland, to the sea, and to the world. And I'd never seen the river that way before. And now here it was, right in my face. Then I learned that had been how Lewiston started as a corridor, as a navigational channel. How I lived there through high school and didn't know there were steamboats on that river, I have no idea. Just like high school kids, I ignored history, I guess. I just didn't know. And so I thought, well, this is fascinating. I want to learn about what it was like to ride those old steamboats from Portland to Lewiston at the founding years. So I just on my own, nobody said I could ride or anything else. Nobody still has, but that doesn't matter. I wrote my very first book called Journal 1862, and this was 1984, I think, it came out. And I wrote it as a journal of a miner, a fictitious man by the name of Timothy Nolan, who boarded an ocean liner, the Brother Jonathan, in San Francisco, took the Brother Jonathan to Portland, and then came on upriver to Lewiston. In 1862, he was going to go to the mines of Pierce City and become a miner. And I wrote his story. I had Carol Grindy, at that time doing her work under Carol Grindy LaFord, illustrating it for me. Carol has since passed away quite recently, but has become quite a well-known sculptor. And if you go to the campus at Lewis Clark State College, the new Sacagawea nursing building, there's an oversized statue of Sacagawea out front that Carol did. So I got her in her very early years. But she illustrated it for me, and I got pictures from the Oregon Historical Society, and I just told the story. It's history, and I told it as I was writing my journal under the name of Timothy Nolan along the trip. So that's where I wanted to start my story today, and that's my map. That's Carol's map, actually. And I'm sorry you can't see the same thing, but this is the route that we're following. Are the lights okay for you guys here? Or, oh, don't mess with I'm sorry. Don't mess with the light. So, and I'm going to, whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. I'm going to follow this route. Here's Astoria. The Brother Jonathan, sorry, I'm shaky. The Brother Jonathan came to Portland, and then I board 3 different boats to make it to Lewiston. And I'll tell you about the boats. It was a 4-day trip, 3 boats, and 2 portages. The first day I boarded the Carrie Ladd. I don't have a picture of the Carrie Ladd, but I boarded a boat owned by the Oregon Navigation Company, and I described the facilities in the boat. This happens to be the T.J. Potter, which is a newer boat, a bigger boat and fancier. But even what I read about the Carrie Ladd, the facilities were really very sumptuous. And these are a bunch of miners heading upriver. So they were going from Portland to the lower Cascades, lavatories, fletching water, someplace I just read a little bit ago that they had a violet or lavender smell in the flush of the toilets, the lavatory. This is the dining hall, and, well, darn it, I'm sorry. I'll get used to this. Oops. And these are the cabins that open. You can barely see them, but they open into the dining halls so that for the passenger cabins. And the next picture is the ladies' salon in the, well, there we go, in the boats, and they had described those two. It was and there were women on board. It was a place where the women could go and get away from the vile behavior of the men. They're spitting and swearing and, these things that they do. So the women had a place to escape. And then the men used the main salon where they could do all those things and not bother the women. The boats had a single smokestack or a double smokestack. They could be side wheeler or stern wheel. The Carrie Ladd happened to be a stern wheel. And the Carrie Ladd then went from Portland to Vancouver, stopped at the fort, picked up things, dropped off things, and then came on up to the Cascades. Not the Cascade Locks yet, just the Cascades. There they had to make a portage. And the portage was a 4.5-mile portage on both the Washington and the Oregon sides that they made around the Cascades. Get out of the boat, all the cargo, everything else had to get out of the boat, go around the portage and get in the next boat. But this I wanted to show you because it was so exciting. This is the little pony that pulled the portage railroad that pulled them across. Well, what's exciting about it is after I wrote this book, I don't know how many years later, Max and I were down at Cascade Locks piddling around, and down on the riverbank near the museum, there's this nice glass-encased pony, the original pony. And it's so cool. It was so exciting. They had found it in San Francisco and brought it back up. And it's the same pony that pulled the portage around. Well, that was the way they managed to go around the Cascades until 1896 when the locks were built. And now take the time next time you're in Cascade Locks and just go down and check out. You can still see where the locks are and see the pony and remember the earlier time. It was pretty exciting. And at the upper Cascades, then, I would board the Idaho. And this was a boat customarily, used frequently by these miners who were coming into the mining country. Some even speculate that possibly the naming of Idaho had something to do with this boat, which was built before Idaho became a territory. So maybe there's a connection. Nobody really knows the origin of Idaho. There's lots of stories, but the name. But this is a side whaler. And the side whaler, I'll go into a little bit more detail of the two. And, darn, this little pointer is just too close. The side whaler is what we mean by that the wheel is on both sides. And it worked fine in the middle Columbia, where between the Cascades and the Dalles, because of the nature of the river. It was a good one. So then from there in the Idaho, I would go on up to Dalles City. And there, we had to get out of the Idaho and spend the night. That was the first night. And then make a 13-mile portage around the Celilo Falls, the lower narrows and the upper narrows. Short narrow and long narrow, sometimes they called it. And then you would go to Deschutes. Initially, at the time I made this trip as Timothy, I was taking a stagecoach. Later on, they built this kind of a narrow gauge railroad arrangement where they would have a big cart, a big flat cart that would go down into the river, and the boat would actually go up on that, and they would convey it around the Dalles or the Celilo obstruction to the upper landing. But in these years, we went to the little place of Deschutes at the mouth of Deschutes River. And amazingly, that is where the next boat was built. And a lot of boats were built at Deschutes that were used above the Celilo Falls area. Just kind of there, they were building boats. They didn't have a factory or anything, just sandbar, they built a boat. These folks were quite amazing. And this was used until 1915 when the locks were built at Celilo. And I'll get into that a little bit later. So then we board the Colonel Wright. This is not the Colonel Wright. This is a picture that was done, as near as I can tell, during the centennial celebration of the creation of Idaho Territory. And Lewiston was celebrating, and some artist, actually looks to me like the Lewiston steamboat, but some artist took the picture and put Colonel Wright on it. It's not the Colonel Wright. But it was the boat that was identified with Lewiston and with the founding of Lewiston. It was built at the mouth of the Deschutes River. It was 110 feet long. It was both a stern wheel and it had a square sail. Somebody called it a cross between a sloop and a steamer. It was a tough little booger, and it had been used to go up the Snake, but never as far as Lewiston until the gold rush, and there was a demand for it now. As somebody also said, it could float on the early morning dew. I think that's an exaggeration, but it had a very, very low draft. The first trip was in May 1st of 1861 under Colonel Len White. And that's when the Oregon Steam Navigation Company knew there was money to be made because people were going into the mines, and, the steamboat company had to take advantage of it, and they did. So with Captain White and then F. Boffman as a pilot, they headed up the Snake as far as they could go. 14 crew and 300 passengers, which is a lot of people going into the mining country, both miners and merchants. And then, of course, they had cargo bound for Pierce City. They had to get the supplies there. The gold had been found the year before, and they were needing supplies critically. So in the Colonel Wright, the first stop was at Wallula Landing. The second stop was at the mouth of the Palouse River. And the third stop would have been Lewiston, but they kept pushing on as far as they could go. And this is Carole's art, too. And this is the description Carole did of the Colonel Wright based on the picture she did based on my description. I think it's probably closer to what the boat looked like than what I just showed you. But they plotted on upriver to, as far as they could go, about 22 miles up the Clearwater. And, of course, they wanted to get as close to the mining country as they could. And they couldn't go any further. Big Eddy up there is about at Lenore, let's say, to give you a current. location. Couldn't get any further, so one of the merchants, a guy by the name of Seth Slater, unloaded his stuff, set up 5 tents, declared it Slaterville, and declared that would be the head of navigation. He was an optimist. These guys were optimists. Man, I love them, you know. The next week, though, the Colonel Wright tried to make the same trip and couldn't quite make it. But, and this is a part of the story, for some reason Lewiston never continues to tell, but there was a third week, and the Okanagan, which was a bigger boat, made it all the way to Slaterville. And now we're at the end of May. And it's looking like maybe Slaterville will be the head of navigation. Then the fourth trip, the first week of June, the Okanagan couldn't go any further than the confluence, and so Lewiston became the head of navigation. And there's Lewiston a little bit later. I think that was in 1882 that picture was taken. People always, I'm sure most of you have seen that. Can you see past me? Okay. People ask about that, and that's a big sand dune that just filled in that area, just blew across from the barren flat across the river, now known as Clarkston, and just filled that in. And, of course, this is Normal Hill. And then this is the original Lewiston. Again, much later than the years I'm talking about. But I left Timothy Nolan there. He made this trip in 1862, the year after the original. He made the trip in 1862, and I left him there intending to take him into Pierce, but I was overwhelmed, and I just wanted the book done. You know how you get that feeling? And I had all these friends, some of who were friends of my parents. And they kept saying, whatever happened to Timothy Nolan? I'm going to die before I learn. Well, unfortunately, this one very favorite man did die before he learned. So I finally decided to finish Timothy's story. This has really nothing to do specifically with rivers, other than it's all about the mining country between 1862 and 1890. And I told the story as if this Timothy, is writing his reminiscence in 1890, looking back over his years in territorial north central Idaho. It's history. It's very frustrating for people because Timothy is me. I mean, I don't see what difference it makes whether I call me or Timothy, but anyway, it's his story, and this book I self-published, and I'm doing a rotten job of marketing. But it is down at Book and Game. I don't think she's sold anything there of it at all. But it was a fun book to write. And I'm told by people who've read it that it's a fun book to read. I don't know about that. But that's why I brought that story, was to finish the Timothy story. But back to the rivers. So Lewiston is the head of navigation, and it is the head of navigation, and stern wheelers are there for the next 78 years, which is a really long time when you think about it. These stern wheelers, there were about 25 altogether over the course of these many years. More at the beginning than at the end. It was on the Snake River, obviously from Lewiston on down river, but also there were times when the boats went up north or south of Lewiston into the canyon, and I'll tell you a little bit more specifically about one, and also up to Clearwater. They performed an important role. They were all stern mounted. There were no side wheelers, and the reason for that is because the way these boats would dock, and they were just pulling into gravel bars and sandbars, to pick up and produce and drop off things and so forth. So they would go against the current and nose into wherever they were landing. Well, obviously a side wheel is going to get hung up, for one thing, in the gravel or the sand or something. But also, that way, they're a lot more maneuverable. They can back out a lot easier. And a lot of times, they've got to then turn around and go into the current with a heavy cargo, so they can immediately take off. They can overcome the inertia a lot faster. So it was always a stern-mounted wheel that was on these upper boats. They were 150 to 160 feet long. If any of you ever remember seeing the Jean, that's no longer in Lewiston, it was about the same size as what these boats are. The Jean never belonged in Lewiston, but it was brought up as a memory, I guess. But it was about the same size. They weighed about 500 tons, and their cargo, the easiest way to identify their cargo is they had about 2,000 to 3,000 sacks of grain was what they would haul, and that was their primary cargo, actually. They would draw about 3 feet of water. If it was much lower, they weren't sure, but I read one place where one boat, J.N. Teal, which was a monster of a boat, managed to go upriver on 1.6 feet of water. And another time, the only time they really couldn't make it was when the rivers were really, really low, either in the summer or, if it was freezing and couldn't make it in the wintertime. But there were times when they were doing it under 2 feet, and, iffy, but they made it. So they were tough little boogers. They had the below deck, this lower section would be where the freight would be, and the engine room, the freight house, boiler deck, all of the mechanics and storage and things. Then every boat was a little different, but the cabins were along here. Some of them had very elaborate, what they call, hurricane deck. Some of them called them a Texas. Some of them had nice, elaborate, decorative kinds of woodwork along it. Others were a little bit more plain. And then the pilot house, the stack, and of course the wheel behind. The stacks were designed so they could collapse. And I always thought it was kind of cool because there were a lot of ferries, at least 2 or 3 ferries, even just on that stretch of the Snake and then the Clearwater, where they had to drop the stack so that they could go under the ferry line because they were the kind of ferries that were lining across with the cable across. So that was a pretty clever way of adapting and keeping people happy. The bridge that was built between Lewiston and Clarkston, however, the first bridge, had that beautiful arc in it because of the steamboats that had to have that kind of clearance. So that bridge, was designed to accommodate that. The fuel was coal or wood, and that wasn't a big problem downriver, but when you get up in the more barren area, the wood access was pretty big problem. So they kept looking for coal deposits. They did find some up Hell's Canyon, but it was inadequate. It just wasn't good enough coal. Now, there were a number of ventures where they tried to run these boats at different places, and I'm not going to get into all that because it's too long, but they did send the Colonel Wright up the Snake beyond Lewiston, hoping to tap into the lucrative mining boom that was in Boise area now. And nobody knows the full story, how far up the Colonel Wright went, but it did plow upriver. Maybe it went up as far as 22 miles above the Snake. The salmon, the mouth of the salmon. I don't know. But they do say, one source says 4.5 days to get up, 3.5 hours back. Another says 5 days up, 8 hours back. It was a quick return trip and a hard trip up. But we don't know much about that. I haven't been able to find a lot of information. But there was a boat built in 1903, and this is the boat. This is one of my favorite boats and one of my favorite pictures. This is the Imnaha. And my interest in this section, this actually leads to my next book, and there is a cheaper, lighter weight, softbound available now, but I don't have one. But anyway, Max and I went into the canyon shortly after we moved there. Neither of us had been there because we just didn't have the opportunity. But we went up with Wally Beamer, and when we got to the mouth of the Imnaha, he showed us that stair step on which the foundation for the stamp mill was built. And that was all that was really there. There were other things there once I learned about it. But he kept saying, this is one big scam. A bunch of investors from the Midwest put all this money into this just to milk their investors, blah, blah, blah. And I kept thinking, oh, come on, that does not make sense. So I decided I'm going to really probe into this. And I'm going to learn about this Hell's Canyon story and the navigation of it. And that led me into all sorts of archives, including the company, the Eureka Mining, Smelting, and Power Company archives. The president's son had given his files to the museum, and we just found wonderful, wonderful things. So I told the story of the mine and of the boat they built, this Imnaha that they built in 1903 to furnish the mines at the mouth of the Imnaha, which is just a ways above the salmon, and then all the other mining, copper mining. And there was a lot of mining going on in the late 1800s, 1890s, into the early 1900s. And so they needed a boat to get the ore out, get supplies in, get passengers in, and so forth. This little booger, this little boat, this Imnaha, was built in Lewiston, and it was so powerful that representatives from Russia and China came to look at the product and look at the print, at the the plans, what they were building from, see how it worked, and they were going to take those plans to their countries. Always wondered if they did. I'd like to follow that through. But they built it. It was launched in July 4th, 1903. They went upriver. There were two big obstructions, one at Wild Goose Rapids, just a little ways above the mouth of the Grand Ronde, and the other at Mountain Sheep Rapids, just a little ways below the mouth of the Imnaha. Those had to be lined through. And in order to line through, you would just basically throw a line around a rock or a tree and secure it, and then use a capstan on the boat and just winch it through the obstructions. And they did that in a number of places along the river, but those two places specifically there. Well, they made the trip and were successful. Everybody in Lewiston applauded a new era. Here is a picture of the Imnaha unloading at the Eureka Bar, and they have a lot of lumber. This is, I can't remember what that is, smokestack or something. But they built a town there, and the town was pretty much built in Clarkston and then disassembled and then sent upriver. So that's what you're seeing there is some of the lumber that's going to be used in the homes. Well, in mouth of the Imnaha, yeah. And in fact, this is the bar, and if you were to hike along, the mouth of the river is right about here. And the tunnels, and I mean, it was a major operation. I wrote 2 or 3 chapters in that book about it. I got so involved in it. So if you want to read about it, you got to get the book. But it's a fascinating story, I think. The Mountain Sheep the Imnaha was a great boat. And the government put it into service to take out a lot of the obstructions in the river, the boulders and so forth that were bothering the navigation. So it was a hard worker, and it was overworked. And then it finally could get back to work doing its job that it was supposed to of hauling stuff up to the mines. However, it didn't make it in November, I'll get the right date, in November of that same year, 1903, 13th trip up, it made it up past the Salmon, winched through the mountains, the Mountain Sheep Rapids, and when they threw the line back, they didn't throw it back so that it could clear the paddle wheel. It got caught in the paddle wheel and the rods that powered it, and immediately the thing stopped. The current turned it sideways in the river, and it was a very narrow place, so everybody could get off quickly. Nobody died. Some rancher in Joseph had this wonderful white stallion that he thought it would be better to get it upriver and then take it on up to Joseph than to take it, ride it and wear it. That was tethered at the front of the boat, and that horse died. One man said, I thought about saving that horse, but then I thought about saving me. But there was no mining equipment on there. There was a lot of loss. It was a terrible accident. It was a terrible loss to the company, but they built another boat, the Mountain Gem. And they fully intended on continuing with the same thing. It was a better boat. It was larger and so forth. But the mining interests had there was just not enough ore there to make it payable for anybody. So they ended up taking the Mountain Gem downriver, and it was used at Pasco for quite a while. It went through all sorts of legal problems, but eventually it ended up there. In the meantime, in Lewiston area, there were a lot of boats serving the whole region. There's a D.S. Baker, Harvest Queen, Almoda, Yakima, Nez Perce Chief, Tenino, Lewiston, Spokane. You see pictures of them, and you hear their names mentioned a lot. And the Annie Faxton, that was a pretty boat. And some people said it was the most beautiful boat on the river. Here it is at the Lewiston Landing. In fact, this is Clarkston here, and there's the river, the mountains, and here's the confluence right there. It was used for the same thing that the rest of hauling passengers, hauling freight, downriver as far as it needed to go, and I'll get into that in a minute. But it was doing fine until 1893. It was downriver, 40 miles below Lewiston, coming into Wade's Bar, and they were beginning to turn against the current to go into the bar. The captain just started to ring the bell to say that we're coming into land. And suddenly there was not a loud explosion so much as just a kind of a grinding boom. And there were two guys, one, I can't remember what their rank was, but one was standing here and another one here. And he looked over, and suddenly the man died, and he looked back, and the entire cabin section just collapsed. Quietly, it just kind of collapsed in itself. And this young man looked at his cabin, at the cabin where his new bride was. So she died. 8 people died on that. It was a terrible, terrible thing.
What caused it?
Well, it was the boiler, which had been inspected by the government inspector just a week or two before. Do with that as you will, but it was not properly inspected. And, you know, nothing anybody could do about it. It just kind of happened. Here's the result. 8 people died, but the amazing thing, I think, is in all 78 years, there were only those 2 boat wrecks. And, you know, you listen to, and I would listen to people talk about this, and they'd say, oh, all these accidents, come on, there were only 2. I mean, compare it to car accidents today. But most of these boats were all doing the same thing. Here's a boat at the mouth of the Lapwai. The Fort Lapwai was a really popular place to go on the Clearwater. And they would load supplies up there, take soldiers during both the 77 war and the 78 Bannock War. They used the boats in the Almota to drop off soldiers, pick up soldiers. In the Bannock War, they went up the Snake to the mouth of the Grand Ronde because there was always that fear that the Bannock War was going to move into the Lewiston area. And they were supplying troops that way, which I thought was pretty interesting and very little written about it. Even during the Spanish-American War, they used the boats to move the troops. But everybody generally were the wheat fleet. And their big job was to pick up the sacked wheat from the upper country that had either been brought down by wagon, but mostly brought down by trams. And those were just kind of, you think of them kind of as an antiquated kind of a ski lift where you'd put the sack up above and they would trolley it down to the lower area, and then they'd warehouse it there and pick it up. I'll show you the warehouse here in a second. Initially, they would take the grain on downriver as far as Celilo. And then when the railroad was finished up the Columbia and on up into Spokane, cut off at Riparia, where the big bridge now is, then they would take the sacked grain just to Riparia and then put it on the railroad. So that was as far west as these boats were going with their grain. And then when the railroad finally came up the Snake on into Lewiston, 1908, I think, then they started using the boats just for picking up the grain on the south side of the Snake and shuttling it over to the railroad, or going up the Snake River as far as Grand Ronde to places like Waha Landing and so forth. And there's a picture of one of the warehouses at Judkin Tram picking up grain from Garfield County. And I like that picture. I think that's good. Another picture of the grain. This is at Waha Landing on the Idaho side south of Lewiston, and also at Cows Creek, 10 Mile, Rogersburg, and Graham's Landing. So if you happen to drive upriver from Asotin, you'll see places, just see some elevators where there was evidence that there had been those boat landings. And you see the sacked wheat. Think of how much moving and shifting of how many people were involved in getting that grain from the farmer down to the railroad and the cost. And then Lewiston was the place where the boats wintered. Here you see the Spokane, Lewiston, Spokane, and the Hannaford is the double-stacked one at the back. I'll talk about that in a sec. But these two, the Lewiston and Spokane, were probably the most popular, most famous workhorses. This is the old Lewiston. There were 4 Lewistons. This is actually the third one, but this is the one that you see most. But there was one other accident in July of 1922 when the Lewiston and Spokane were docked at Lewiston. It was hot, July, Lewiston hot, and everything was dry. The engines were off. It had nothing mechanically going on at all, but suddenly both of them just caught fire and burned to the water line. And speculation is that a couple rats were chewing on some matches or something, but that was the end of those 2 boats. and they were rebuilt so that we have another Lewiston and another Spokane. Probably what got my attention most, I'm going a little longer than I should be here, excursions were popular. Church groups, schools, they had wonderful excursions. They would go above Lewiston, up the Clearwater, to Rogersburg, down to Alamota, and they'd usually charge about $1. They'd have a band, they'd dance on board, and I got a little carried away. No, just day trips. Yeah. And this is another good one. When on the inauguration day of the Imnaha going upriver, it took them an hour to get from Clarkston to Asotin. I walked that, it doesn't take me an hour. So, and that is another example. This is the Lewiston, probably down at Alamota, but I'm not sure where that location is. Another excursion. This is my favorite. This is the Lewiston up the river, probably at Wild Goose. That was a popular place to go. And they kept trying to go further south of Lewiston, but they couldn't get beyond that. Wild Goose is about 3 miles above the mouth of Rogersburg, about the mouth of the Grand Braun at Rogersburg. But look at the people. They're all dolled up. There's a mob of humanity there. They're having a wonderful time. And then there was another boat, another trip. This is a Lewiston. They loved to go up the Clearwater because there were trees up the Clearwater. And here you can see trees. But there was a wonderful trip on the Clearwater that I got so intrigued about. I learned about it when I was writing my journal. And I had to write about it just because it had to be told. So I wrote this Clearwater Steam, Steel, and Spirit. And this book has been redone by the Historical Society, and it's theirs. It belongs to them now. But what intrigued me was this trip that was taken by the Lewiston to Kamei. And you drive that river, and you think, that river hasn't changed that much. I mean, it's narrower now because there's roads and railroads. In 1896, they were the Union Pacific, who was kind of at war with the Northern Pacific now over who's going to navigate or control the Clearwater route. They decided that they were going to prove that that river was navigable. Boats had gone as far as Orfino and even as far as Greer, but not a lot, and it was only certain times of the year they could do it. But this Lewiston left with a bunch of dignitaries from the Union Pacific and the town. 2 o'clock in the morning, they took off, headed upriver, stopped at the Lapwai Agency, successfully navigated the big obstruction at Big Eddy, kept on going to Greer's Ferry where they spent the night. Next morning, they're plodding into uncharted territory in what they called the Narrow Box Canyon, sometimes called the Black Canyon. When you go up to Kamei beyond Orfino, it does narrow up there. And they made it just as the church there at the mouth of Conrad, at the mouth of the Lapwai, at a little town called Conrad, just as they were getting out of church, and the comment was, they didn't even have time to finish the doxology. They heard the toot, and out they hurried. Yeah, you would. And they were back at Lewiston in 8 hours. So again, you got that quick trip back. Well, they were trying to prove that the river was navigable, and they did, but their next efforts failed. Also, the Northern Pacific was busy building their railroad. They'd already brought it down into Lewiston, and now they were going to run it up the Clearwater. Both of them were kind of objective was, for one thing, the mining boom up at Buffalo Hump. Also, maybe a route on across to Bitterroots. I mean, that dream hadn't died yet. The Northern Pacific built this Hannaford, double-stacked Hannaford, with the intention of using it to continue the river, the road construction on above the mouth of Potlatch. It was built at the Potlatch River. And as they were building, they continued on up the Clearwater, and the charges were that every time they had an opportunity to blast, they would blast their rocks into the river to make sure that the river wouldn't be navigable for the Union Pacific. I don't know how true that was. But the Union Pacific got back at them and insisted that because the government had declared that river navigable, that they had better have an opening span at the bridge at Kamei. And they did that. No, this is Kamei. This is at Kamei. That bridge, and I've talked to people who actually said they've seen that thing open. It's the same bridge. They opened it. They had to prove, and they had tested a couple times, but it's that same bridge. I've never seen it open. But anyway, if you want to run a steamboat up there, they got to open the boat thing for you. So that ended that dream. The boats continued, but then in 1915, a big celebration occurred when finally the Celilo Canal was built. And all of this competition, the monopoly that the railroad had, the exorbitant rates they were charging, now the boats could go from Portland to Lewiston, pick up all the cargo, wheat, fruit, passengers, everything. And everybody was ecstatic. And so they had this wonderful celebration in 1915. They sent a flotilla up from Portland, went to Lewiston, and that was the beginning of the celebration. And they even took the J.N. Teal. This is that big boat I was telling you about that went on 1.5 feet of water. They took that on up to Rogersburg to prove that the river could be navigated beyond Lewiston. And then they came back, had this day-long celebration of talks and dances and floats and, everything. People from everywhere, bands from the universities came down, and it was a big deal. And then the next day, they all headed downriver for their downriver celebration. And in every town, first at the Twin Cities, there was no Richland yet. Kennewick and Pasco, Wallula for the Walla Walla people, Umatilla, the Dalles, on down. Vancouver had their celebration, Portland had their celebration, and then Astoria. And they took this flotilla from Lewiston to Astoria to prove that what a wonderful thing now has happened. And reasonable rates were now to be had by all, and everybody was happy. But as I was researching all this, every report I saw, there was a big cover story of how many cars people had driven to their, to the sites. And nobody said, nobody put two and two together, but this was really too late, too much too late. And by then, the roads had taken over, the railroads reduced their rates, trucks started shipping stuff. It was the end of an era. So their big celebration ended. I love this picture just because it's a cool picture. Too little, too late. The wheat fleet in Lewiston continued to operate, however, until by 1939, there wasn't much business at all. And so they decided that they were going to take the last steamboat to Lewiston. This is the newer version of the beautiful old Lewiston that you saw pictures of after the fire. But they were going to take Lewiston downriver. The Union Pacific owned it, and they wanted to send it to Portland. It left very reluctantly, and it was kind of interesting. By now, the Blue Bridge, what we call the Blue Bridge, was in green, had just been built, and they had to raise the bridge. Well, and the boat was upriver from the bridge. So between the boat where it would start and stop and start and stop, they couldn't get the engine running, and it'd go for a while and stop. And then the bridge refused to go, went up halfway up, and didn't go any further. Finally, they got everything together, and the Lewiston limped its way down to Portland. And the bridge didn't have to have a steamboat under it anymore. It worked for a while as the Barry Cay in Portland, and then in 1943 it went up to the Yukon. The government owned it and took it up there. And that was the end of the steamboat era in the Lewiston Valley. And it was an exciting era. But the thing that got my interest in it was in 1975, the boats were back with this big celebration where the Portland brought in a flotilla to celebrate the slackwater and return of navigation to the valley. So that's my talk. Yes. Yes.
Did you just say that the last time the Lewiston went down the river, it was owned by Union Pacific?
The Union Pacific owned it, yeah.
When did the railroad get into the
Well, the
boat?
Union Pacific actually, the Oregon Steam Navigation Company became the Oregon Railroad Navigation Company, which was consolidated with the Union Pacific, subsidiary, I should say, of the Union Pacific. That happened about 1890s. Yeah. And I'm writing about Clarkston, the founding of Clarkston right now, and Adams, the railroad president's grandson. And it was during his period as president of the Union Pacific that all that happened. And he had big dreams for getting all this going again. So.
Who was building the steamboats in the 80s and 90s?
Most of them were Oregon
But still
Steam
Oregon
Navigation. Well, by then
Navigation.
Oregon Railroad Navigation Company. There was competition all through this period, but they had a monopoly, and they'd put, somebody'd build a boat, and then it shows up under their ownership. So their monopoly was pretty profound through there. The only one, the Hannaford, was in Northern Pacific. And there were others, I can't think exactly, but most of them were Oregon. Yeah.
How many of these boats were independents? You know, Joe Blow owned it, and he and his family ran
That's a good
it.
question. In the early years, the Cascadilla was, the Spray was, another one, a bunch of them. And again, they built them, they ran them, and then they sold them. And maybe they even built them thinking that they were going to sell them. You know, that was their source of income. But I can't tell you how many were. But one thing I did forget to mention, there were two boats that did come through the canyon, the Shoshone in 1870 and the Norman in 1895, I think. And I did describe those trips through the canyon because that's amazing to think of those steamboats. I mean, think about those steamboats coming down through Hell's Canyon. But that also got me interested in in the mail boat era. And I wrote 2 or 3 chapters about the whole period of mail boats deep into the canyon, too, which is a whole other river-related story, but there's not time tonight. So, any other questions? Yeah?
So the Idaho steamboat, when did that operate? Before 1860s or?
The one in the central, well, I think it was 58 it was built. Yeah, and I'm not too sure when it was taken off the river. Most of those, I don't know, I'd have to look it up to make sure.
So where did the name Idaho come from for that steamboat?
Yeah, how did they get the name Idaho on that boat? I don't know. And that some suggest that the name came from Colorado, and I don't know how the boat got named that. It'd be nice to. Yeah. There's a research project for you. Find out why that boat was named Idaho.
That was a question on NPR, wasn't it? Yeah. That they had 3 things, one of which was a lobbyist made up the name for Idaho.
Yeah, I've heard that one, yeah. And then, of course, Joaquin Miller, who the great poet who was also a Pony Express man in the area, he said it meant sun coming over the mountains. No, I don't think so. Ness per se, that isn't what it meant. Yeah, that's 1850.
That was like 30 years before the state. So.
The state, but the territory had been named just 2 years later, 3 years later, 53. Yeah.
The territory is named in 1860.
63 when the territory was created.
So it's still
predated the territory. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how. Good question. Any other questions I can't answer? Yes.
Okay, you showed us the picture of the railroad bridge at Kamiak.
Uh-huh.
Is that the same bridge that was built at Arrow Junction? I mean,
it does look like. I don't think so.
Because they both had the swivel.
Yeah, I don't think so. That bridge was put there when the railroad went up in 1903. So.
And Arrow Junction wasn't put in until 28 or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe they liked the look so well.
Well, I was going to say the function.
They look, yeah.
Yeah.
It's probably a standard model. They just pulled it out of the catalog.
Yeah.
Sears.
This looks like a good bridge. But in this book, I got into the survey of the river in 1872 because they were of the Clearwater, because they were trying to determine if it was navigable even then. And they were saying as far as Stites, maybe, for sure as far as the mouth of the Middle Fork. So they had dreams, big dreams. Any other questions?
Just a comment. I've heard old timers along the Clearwater say that up until, into the 1960s and whatnot, you could still see where they dredged the river bottom around Fur Island, where it was so shallow there for the steamboats to run around.
And that was one of the big obstructions that they had there, yeah. And, I think, I was just reading the old paper. I always read these old papers instead of the new ones, but I was reading a paper just a little bit ago, and I saw an account of a riverboat trip up the Clearwater in, I don't remember what year now, and I was just researching something totally different. So I think there were a lot more trips up the Clearwater by these steamboats than I had any knowledge of when I wrote that book, I'm sure. So it was kind of common. You just, it was so, we don't write about cars that take trips places. It was so common, people didn't write about it that much. But The trips above into the canyon were kind of unique, though. Anything else? Well, thank you all. I didn't mean to keep you so late, but we got a late start, so thanks again.
And again, Carole has 2 of the
Yeah.
publications.
This is out of